The story of slavery in America is usually told in a simple North South narrative, but in actuality, things are far more complex and, quite frankly, quite uncomfortable. Why had Northern states already abolished slavery decades before the Civil War, while the South held back? Our argument today is that Northern abolition wasn't a stroke of moral lightning. It was a slow going result of economic changes, religious values, and revolutionary ideas about freedom that had made slavery incompatible with the North's developing sense of self. Let's begin. To get to the why, we should take a trip back to the period immediately after the American Revolution. You've just fought a war, crying out liberty, and resisting tyranny in the name of the fight. With that language comes powerful expression, and it began to backfire in this country on the institution of slavery. But then there's the first critical point economics. The North's economy was branching out into manufacturing, shipping, and small scale agriculture. Slave labor was less vital to this model than it was to the large cash crop plantations of the South. Thus, the economic incentive to promote slavery was less compelling. Religious movements also most prominently among Quakers. They started to passionately proclaim that slavery was a sin against God. So there you have this powerful convergence, revolutionary rhetoric about freedom, religious denunciation, and an economy that could afford to dream up a different future. That confluence produced the first significant milestone, Pennsylvania's gradual Abolition Act of 1780. This was the first law of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. But in this is a huge but. It was filled with compromises from the start. It didn't free a single person who was already enslaved. Rather, it promised that future children born to enslaved mothers would be free. If that child served their mother's master as an indentured servant until 28 years old, this was not clean. It wasn't comprehensive, and it was a plan to placate slave owners. Pennsylvania's mold thus crystallized as the North's blueprint. In the decades that followed, states such as New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut picked up with their own slow laws. So the stage was not laid by instant justice, but by a gradual.
The laws in themselves reveal the deep ambivalence of the Northern position. Let me cite two documents and my own analysis: Pennsylvania's 1780 Act and New York's 1799 Act. First, the language. Pennsylvania's Act has a preamble that is powerfully revealing. It exalts God's help in achieving deliverance from British tyranny, and outright calls Americans to extend their own mercy to the enslaved. The ideals of the Revolution are applying directly, and uncomfortably, to slavery. But then you get to the laws themselves. There's New York's 1799 law, let's consider. It says any child born after July 4th of that year is free. Sounds great, right? But the next clause, the provided nevertheless, is the compromise. That child would be an indentured servant to the owner of the mother until 25 or 28 years of age. This was not freedom at birth. This was delayed freedom after a life of unpaid labor. The laws were similarly laden with economic protections for enslavers. In New York, an owner who didn't want the cost of raising that free child could give them away to the poor authorities and send them to be a ward of the state. And at every stop, the law guarded the slaveholder's pocketbook. And this wasn't just theoretical. Even George Washington, president in Philadelphia, knew that he was taking advantage of a loophole. He rotated his enslaved servants, such as his chef Hercules and Martha's maid Ona Judge, out of Pennsylvania every 6 months to prevent them from claiming freedom under the state's law. He knew the legal bounds exactly. So what do these documents say? A conflicted attitude, a moral acknowledgement that slavery was wrong, grounded in revolutionary liberty, but a practical refusal to cause immediate economic and social suffering. The gradual policy was a sharp contrast to the South, where the cotton boom in the late 1700s made slavery more entrenched, more profitable and more defensible as a positive good. The North was gradually unlearning itself, while the South was reaffirming. And that disentanglement, as messy as it was, had monumental consequences. Bhavna, true, these laws were flawed, not the least of which could be said about their transformative power. For the first time on an unprecedented scale, they added a free black population to the Northern Territories. That was the most immediate consequence of this. Now, citizens who were legally free could marry, earn money, establish institutions such as churches and even teach their children. They may then, as the text puts it, create a new identity. That created a legal and moral beachhead. It generated a physical environment where the case for universal freedom was real, not at the level of abstract thought. But we are allowed to stand by the boundaries. Gradual abolition meant that slavery itself, and the racial hierarchy upon which it rested, remained in the North for years. Anyone born in New York in 1800 could have been enslaved long into the 1820s. And freedom did not equal equality. Black Northerners experienced extensive racial discrimination, violence and political alienation. So, for our first, why, question, Northern abolition arose out of this convergence of moral, economic, and ideological influences. But its deepest legacy was this: it was a line that it drew on the map, both literally and morally. It established a part of the country where slavery was, by law, condemned to cease. This had an impact on the entire future of the United States. It provided the seeds for the abolitionist cause, established the relationship between free states and slave states that would cause the Civil War, and laid the groundwork for emancipation that was achieved, in its full sense, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment after the war. And when the 13th Amendment is over again, this photo is a powerful one. Ultimately, the Northern story is not one of purity. It's a tale of compromise, economic calculation and one's limited horizon. But it's also a story that shows the seed of universal liberty can sprout up, and even if it is a slow and halting course change for good on certain occasions, a great one still can bring about major changes in history after all.